In today's special episode, I'm shining a light on the Descendants Project and their remarkable efforts to preserve their heritage and environment. And then we're taking a little trip down memory lane and re-airing one of our favorite interviews from Bill Chapman of Enon Hall. But first, I'm Stacy Grinsfelder, and I'm flying solo today. You're listening to True Tales from Old Houses. Hello, everyone. It has been a very long time since I sat behind the mic all by myself. Daniel is noticeably absent, but he will be back next week. Today's episode is a little different, and before we get into it, I'd like to say a special thank you to our sponsors, The Window Course, Sutherland Wells, Repaint Studios, and Old House Hub. You know, it's funny when I read that, I always call it Old House Hug the first time around, and that's kind of what it feels like, just an old house hug. This episode is special because we are participating in Podcasthon, a global initiative to raise awareness for nonprofits and charitable causes. Now, this is the first year that we're participating in this global initiative, which unites over 1,000 podcasters globally. There is no money involved. It's just all about raising awareness for various nonprofits and charitable causes. Each podcast gets to choose their own nonprofit or charity. Now, large nonprofits and charities get plenty of exposure, but smaller ones often do not. And Podcasthon is an opportunity to amplify their voices and bring attention to their very important work. So about the nonprofit we chose. I'm going to be the first to admit that Daniel and I are two white people in the North who know very little about what it's like to even live in the South. And we know absolutely nothing about being descendants of the enslaved. So today we're shining a light on the Descendants Project, a 501c3 nonprofit organization founded in 2020 by twin sisters Dr. Joy and Jo Banner. Their mission is to preserve the health, land, and heritage of the Black descendant community in Louisiana's river parishes. Their mission is deeply rooted in combating the environmental and social injustices that have plagued their community, particularly those arising from the region's industrial expansion. The area between Baton Rouge and New Orleans is often referred to as Cancer Alley due to its high concentration of petrochemical plants and refineries. This 85-mile stretch has over 200 facilities contributing to elevated cancer rates and other health issues among residents, in part because in the early 1990s, the zoning changed from residential to commercial. Many of these industrial sites are situated on former plantation lands where the ancestors of current Black communities were once enslaved. The legacy of environmental racism continues as these communities face disproportionate exposure to pollution and its associated health risks. In 2024, Dr. Joy and Jo Banner made history by purchasing the Woodland Plantation, the site where the largest slave revolt in U.S. history began in 1811. This acquisition marked the first time the plantation came under Black ownership, symbolizing a powerful reclamation of their heritage. That same year, they successfully halted a proposed grain terminal project by Greenfield, Louisiana, LLC. The project threatened to exacerbate environmental hazards in Wallace, a historic Black community. After a 3-year legal battle, Greenfield canceled its plans in August 2024, preserving the community's health and historical integrity. With the grain terminal project halted, the Descendants Project is focusing on transforming the Woodland Plantation into a center for community engagement and education. Their plans include developing the Liberation Labyrinth, a space dedicated to commemorating struggles against slavery, colonialism, and industrial encroachment. This initiative aims to provide a place for reflection and healing, connecting the community to its rich history while fostering discussions on environmental justice and cultural preservation. Now, if like us, you're inspired by the Banner's dedication to preserving their community's heritage and combating environmental injustice, please consider supporting the Descendants Project. Visit their website at thedescendantsproject.org to learn more about their initiatives and how you can contribute. And if you live in the area, you might even consider volunteering or simply spreading the word about their vital work. Dr. Joy and Jo did a short segment for NPR and also Good Morning America, and I'm going to link to both of those and the Descendants Project website in the show notes. These sisters exemplify how preserving the past can empower a community's future. True Tales from Old Houses is supported by The Window Course. The The window course, created by Scott Seidler of the Craftsman blog, is a step-by-step, do-it-yourself program that will teach you, the homeowner, everything you need to know to successfully restore your wood windows. It's self-paced, so you can go as fast or as slow as you need, and there are several price points to fit your needs and budget.
Stacy, I know it's hard to believe, but spring is just right around the corner, so now is the perfect time to get ready to restore the windows at your house. The window course has all of the information you need all in one place.
Scott is offering all of his students a special deal. If you sign up for the lifetime access package or the training package, then you'll also get a free infrared paint remover, and that's a $100 value.
The window course is also offered with a money-back guarantee, and Scott is offering True Tales from Old Houses listeners a special discount. So for 10% off, visit thewindowcourse.com and use the coupon code TrueTales.
True Tales from Old Houses is also supported by Sutherland Wells. All of Sutherland Wells products are handcrafted in Providence, Rhode Island, with the highest quality, sustainably grown tung oil. Tung oil, which is native to China, has been used for centuries as a durable finish for wood, metal, and stone.
Unlike polyurethane, tung oil finish penetrates the surface of the wood, so it flexes and contracts as conditions change, making it the perfect pre-finish or protectant for everything from fine furniture to window sash and sills.
Now, you used a Sutherland Wells product on your porch floor, correct?
I did. Most recently, I used the exterior polymerized tung oil in medium luster for my brand new Doug Fir porch flooring. After 3 coats, it is absolutely gorgeous and holding up beautifully this winter.
And that's the same one I actually used on my wainscoting in the bathroom upstairs. But no matter what project you're working on, Sutherland Wells has an entire product line. So if you're working on siding, hardwood floors, furniture restoration, cutting boards, you name it, they've got a product for you.
To learn more about the complete product line, visit Sutherland Wells, that's WELLES, sutherlandwells.com. And to save 10% on your first order, use the coupon code TrueTales.
As I mentioned at the top of the show, today we're resharing part 1 of an interview with Bill Chapman from Enon Hall. This one is an oldie from way back in 2020. In fact, Devin was still my co-host. Hey, Devin, I know you're still out there listening, and I miss you. We're resharing this interview because during that conversation, Bill was just beginning to understand that his ancestors, who had previously owned Enon Hall for generations, had been slave owners. And the family cemetery on the property included unmarked graves of the enslaved. In the years since that interview, Bill has been devoted to uncovering the names of the enslaved people who once lived on his property. By giving them back their names, he seeks to honor their memory and acknowledge their humanity. He's been documenting that ongoing research on his Instagram account, and we invite you to check it out, and I'll link to it right in the show notes.
Hi, I'm Bill Chapman, and along with my wife, Gay, we are the owners of Enon Hall, which is an old family home in Virginia's Northern Neck. We've owned it since 1999 and have been working on it pretty much nonstop ever since.
Excellent. It is such a pleasure to meet you, Bill. I'm so excited that you agreed to do this interview with Devin and I. It's really nice to have you here.
Likewise. Great to meet you all as well.
Your blog, basically when you started your blog in 1999, it was sort of considered the granddaddy of the house blog movement. And I love that. You wrote that. I read that yesterday on Enon Hall, and it just tickled me. I thought it was really great. But you're right. I mean, did you use AOL back then? That's what it made me think of.
No, I think AOL had declined by then, but it was not a blog. That word didn't even exist yet. So when we first bought this house, I didn't know where to begin. So my idea was to have a website where I could post photos and find other experts who had already been down the road of historic preservation and be able to post a photo of here's the situation we're dealing with. I need some advice. And I did make some of those contacts initially, but then very quickly I started journaling, and I just called it the online journal. And again, this was 1999. Google wasn't prominent. The first photos that I posted on the website were taken with a film camera and scanned. It was a few months later when I actually bought a digital camera, and it was terrible. And back then, everybody was on dial-up, so the photos I was posting were tiny. And if I go back to the website now, I instinctively want to click on the photos and make them bigger. And no, they don't get bigger. They're tiny because everybody was using modems to access the website.
Right. Remember dial-up and the pictures, and they'd come in sort of a line at a time and you'd wait for the picture.
Yes, absolutely. So then it became kind of a way to chronicle our experience. And I believe the first post was the day that we closed on the property. What I didn't expect to happen was for this community to form and for all these followers to find out about our project and find out about the website. And over the years, really become participants in the website. And then we started seeing, with more blogging software and so forth, we started seeing more folks starting Old House blogs.
All right. Well, we'll get to the part where you built a community and people started to recognize you. But Devin, would you like to ask the first question?
Sure. Let's just start at the beginning. How did you end up in Enon Hall and what's your connection to it?
So that answer begins in 1970. Honest to goodness, it begins in 1970 when I was 7 years old. And my grandfather, who was a Hathaway, who grew up in this area, he showed me this big fat book called Hathaways of America that had just come out. And in there was a very small photo of Enon Hall. And the caption was that William Hathaway purchased this home and so forth, and had been in the family for so many generations. And my name is William Hathaway Chapman. So as a 7-year-old, as a kid who was very interested in history, that just spoke to me and fascinated me that there was a house somewhere that had been in my family for that long. And at 7 years old, I said, one of these days, I'm going to buy that house back, which tells you a little bit about my personality, because we did, in fact, do that. You know, when I first met Gay, and even before I believe we were engaged, and that whole process was very short. I'd known her we'd been dating for about 6 months when we got engaged and were married 6 months later. So, but it's somewhere in that process, I said, there's this house out there in Whitestone, Virginia, and someday I want to buy it back. And it's a mess. And she didn't run away.
She said, yes, please. Let's go do that.
Well, actually, you know, so the house was owned by a couple who in 1999 were both 94 years old. And they had bought the house in the 60s and they were already retired. And they had done some work on the house and then it just absolutely got away from them and was completely overgrown and just a mess. They were pretty famous for chasing off descendants who came to the property to see the house or to visit the graveyard. I came here and would just quietly clean up the graveyard every once in a while. So Mr. Hayden, the husband, came to know who I was and came to trust me. And slowly we started to have conversations. And sitting on the screen porch, I first broached the subject of, you know, if you ever want to sell the place, I'd love to talk to you about it. Because I was convinced that anybody else would buy it and tear it down.
Sure.
I was the only one in the planet that would save the house. And this is an area, it's a waterfront piece of property. This is an area where a lot of expensive houses are built along the water. So it would be a desirable piece of property for somebody. And he kind of pushed back and said, you know, I could never get the house cleaned up enough to show it. And he took me in one room in the house. And there was a path wide enough for him to take his walker through. And I could see into the center hall passage and see that obviously nobody had been upstairs for many, many, many years because the staircase was just covered with bags. And so it was a combination of, I think, somebody, the wife with hoarding tendencies, then had Alzheimer's and everything just compounded. So I talked to Gay and I said, would we be willing to buy this house without going inside it?
Right.
I've seen one room. Gay had never stepped foot inside it. We stood outside and looked at the condition of the exterior and said, okay, you have to assume the inside is just as bad. Is this something we want to do? And she said, yes. Amazingly, she said, yes. And I can tell you on that day when we stood there and had that conversation, you could look around the property and have no idea that there was water anywhere because things were so overgrown. So it wasn't even a decision based on, oh, this could be such a beautiful piece of property.
Right. Right location. Perfect location. Yeah.
Yeah. No, to her, it reminded her of her summers going down to Georgia and spending the summers in her grandmother's old house, and all the cousins would gather there. And that's what it spoke to for her. It spoke to an experience of a place to go with our son and nieces and nephews. And recreate some of those experiences.
Well, what a lot of trust you two had in each other to just sort of take this leap of faith. And Gay said yes, and you'd wanted it since you were 7 and you'd seen one room. I mean, you knew what you were getting into. And I really appreciate the idea that you said the house just got away from them. I think that's a really respectful and important way to say that about people who've lived in these old houses for a very long time, because, they're part of the story too.
And I appreciate that. And we were fortunate to have some overlap with Mr. Hayden as well. He had done a fair amount of work to the house when they first bought it. Because I wasn't able to ever walk through the house while he was still living there, we bought it with a life estate for the couple. So again, this was part of the deal. You can stay there as long as you can, as you want, as you're able, but we had purchased the home. She went into a nursing home pretty soon after we closed, and he lived there for almost another year. And we would come on the weekends and just start clearing out the property. And I think he really appreciated seeing some activity and some forward momentum. He told me that Mrs. Hayden, she always said, if God wanted something to grow, who was she to cut it down? Everything grew.
Right.
And he pointed us to one of our first discoveries. He said, there's an old brick walk out there leading to the Dutch Colonial. And it had long since just been totally overgrown. And we were so excited to go out there and start digging away the turf and uncovering this brick walk.
Okay, so I've got a quick question and then probably a longer question. The quick question is, did you name it Enon Hall or was it always Enon Hall?
We did not name it. That name goes back to at least the 1870s. That's the earliest that I've found it in written records.
Okay. And then the long question is, obviously this house was not move-in ready. So how long did you work on the house before it was safe to inhabit?
So when we purchased it, again, with a life estate, Mr. Hayden lived here for another year. And then after he died, his executor spent months and months and months cleaning it out. So it was almost another 6 months after he died before we stepped foot in the house. And our intent at the time was not to inhabit it. Our intent was for it to be a weekend place.
Oh, I see.
But the biggest problem was the stink. It smelled terrible because they had, depending on who you ask locally, a lot of people tell you there were 60 cats living here. And apparently the cats had a wonderful relationship with all the mice and just let them live and do their thing. Step number one was trying to get the stink out of the house and worried that we would never be able to do that. I wound up tearing off everything from the 20th century except for our screen porch because there were several shed additions onto the back of the house, the creek side of the house, that had really become animal places and they were disgusting. And the more of that I tore off, the more the smells started to dissipate. And, we would show up Saturday mornings for the weekend and just brace ourselves opening the door going, okay, is it any better or is it worse? And it took a couple years. So initially when we stayed here, we slept on the screen porch. We couldn't even come in the house because just the odor and the filth was too much.
So at this point then, did Gay sort of look at you now and then and say, oh, Bill, what have we done?
She should have, but she didn't. I've also always said that her patience is extremely elastic. She's a project person, as you can tell from our Instagram and from the website. Has always been, roll up her sleeves and get in. And one of the first indicators that we had this potential as a couple was not long after we were married. I inherited an old sleep sofa and a wing chair from my grandmother, and they needed reupholstering. They looked terrible. And Gay looked at them and said, we can do that.
That's great.
And we worked together, and I very carefully took all the fabric off and made drawings of how it had been attached and affixed. And she used the old fabric as patterns to make the new. And then we, put it all back together. And she learned that from her father. She watched her father kind of had that can-do attitude. And I always joke, and it's not a joke, it's the truth. When we got married, she had way more power tools than I did.
So tell us about the history of Enon Hall itself. I know that the Dutch colonial portion is 18th century. So give us a little bit of a timeline of when Enon Hall and how it came along and how it's built out.
So my great-grandfather bought the property in 1762. And at the time, it was called Andrews. It was 200 acres. And in the deed, it indicates that there was a dwelling and outbuildings here at the time. So we don't know exactly what that looked like. We believe that Andrews is incorporated into the base of the Dutch colonial. The house, every 30 years, the house would change. A new generation, a new marriage, a new wife, would say, well, I want another room. We want to build an extension, just what happens today. So the house really didn't take that Dutch colonial form with the gambrel roof until probably 1800, 1805. And we believe at that time, the smokehouse and the kitchen quarters were also built because they are exactly 40 feet away from each corner of the Dutch colonial, very symmetrical layout in the yard. And then, there was an additional room built, or a story and a half built in the 1850s. And then that roof was raised to create this room that I'm in now, which was used as a law office in the 1880s. So this room is actually Victorian, where other parts of the house are, as the cellar is pre-Revolutionary War, then the Dutch colonial is more post-war, early 1800s. If you go upstairs, where I'm working on a guest room or one of the bedrooms in the Dutch colonial right now, that saw a remodel probably in the 1820s, again in the 1880s, and again in the 1970s.
That's very cool.
Even late 19th century, there was an L built out the back of the house that only seems to have been there for about 30 years. And I was told it was pretty poorly built, so it didn't last long.
True Tales from Old Houses is supported by Repaint Studios. Okay, confession time, Daniel. In the past, how did you store your paint tray when you were mid-project?
You're not going to like this, but I would use those cheap plastic liners and then I would store them in the trash.
No judgment from me. I used a trash bag and that was a sticky, icky mess. But now I use the repaint tray.
Okay, me too, but let's spread the word.
Billy, who invented the repaint tray, knew that this was a problem for so many. So she created the solution, and now her woman-owned business is disrupting the painting industry. The repaint tray solves that mid-project paint storage problem. It has a reusable silicone liner, an airtight lid, and it keeps your paint fresh for weeks. It's like Tupperware, but for your paint tray.
And the tray itself, I'd like to note, is a very heavy-duty metal, so it doesn't slide around, wobble, or bend when you're using it. Plus, when you're done painting, you can just let the paint dry in the silicone liner, and then you get to peel it off, which is exactly as satisfying as it sounds.
The tray, silicone liner, and lid, they're all built to last. So that's better for you and for the planet. It is the last paint tray you'll ever need.
Snag one for yourself at repaintstudios.com.
And for 10% off your order, use the coupon code TrueTales10. True Tales from Old Houses is also supported by Old House Hub, brought to you by My Old House Fix. I have a question for you, Daniel. Have you ever spent hours scrolling Facebook groups, Reddit threads, obscure websites, random YouTube videos, trying to find answers about your old house project?
Stacy, I'm an old homeowner. Of course I've done that. Not to mention, those like deep dives where you come out 3 hours later and you know everything about Victorian paint colors, but you still have zero idea how to fix your house.
And that's why we're so excited to tell everyone about Old House Hub from My Old House Fix.
It's like a headquarters for all things old house. It's an exclusive online community where you can gather resources, browse archives by topic, connect with fellow enthusiasts, and get expert advice. It's also a place where you can share your passions without getting lost in endless social media feeds.
And there's no creepy AI algorithm suggesting totally unrelated content. It's just good, meaningful conversations with people who get it. So no more scrolling, no more headaches, just connection and answers.
It's beautiful. It's like old school internet for old house lovers. And the best part is right now, True Tales from Old Houses listeners can get a 1-year membership to Old House Hub for free with the coupon code TrueTales.
That great deal is only available during this season of the podcast. When season 12 ends, the deal ends.
So don't wait. Visit oldhousehub.com to join the Old House Hub community for free and finally get a go-to place for your old house questions, projects, and inspiration.
So let's talk about the cemetery that you have on your property. I would love to hear more about the cemetery.
Yeah, so the graveyard has dates, or the markers have dates going back to, I believe the earliest one is the 1850s, and then go up to 1920. The wall itself was built around 1920. There are 2 giant English boxwood in there, and all of the grave markers are oriented along one wall, and then the other half, there are no markers. So we had a ground penetrating radar study done last year to try to determine, is the other half of that graveyard empty, or are there disturbances in there that would indicate earlier graves? And it is definitely not empty. There are a lot of graves in there that are unmarked, which makes sense because there are generations who lived here who aren't represented by markers. So either they would have had earlier wooden markers that have long since disappeared. So it was a kind of a question, was when this wall was built in 1920, was it built around existing graves, or was it allowing for room for growth?
Right.
Graveyard growth is a weird concept, but
yeah,
for additional inhabitants. So there are definitely additional graves in there. There is also the family story that's been passed down through the generations is that one of the enslaved people who lived here, a lady named Priscilla Fauntleroy, who I can find her going back into estate inventories going back to 1844. She was born around 1815 and died in 1887. Supposedly, she was so beloved that she was buried in the family graveyard. But of course, there's no marker there.
There's no marker, right. Part of our problematic history.
Yeah. So, and, you talk about problematic history. If you own an old home in the South, it is very likely to come with history. If that old home in the South happens to be your family's old home, then you're living with that history.
Right.
And, for us, this has been such a learning process. I've often said that old houses, if you pay attention, they're constantly teaching you something. And for us, this has been an evolution from something that as a 7-year-old was a photo in a book that meshed with stories that my grandparents used to always share about living in this area. It was a romantic dream to own the ancestral home. And it was a very pure dream without any baggage, or a very pure vision. But the more you start looking around and realizing that this was a plantation, this was what would be classified as a small to middling plantation, because at any given point between 1771, which is the earliest slave listing that I've seen in an estate inventory, to the Civil War, at any given point, there were between 16 and 24 enslaved people living here. When we first bought the place, we knew that one of the outbuildings was a kitchen. And several years later, there was an older African-American gentleman here who was helping to dig out our well, where the well had run dry. It's a hand-dug well. And anyway, he was here and he immediately looked at the kitchen and said, "That's a slave quarters."
Wow.
And
yeah, it's hard. It's hard. You all right? It's, there's been a few times during this conversation where I felt a little teary, and this is really emotional. And, yeah. So how about, you can't change the history that you inherited, but you're now part of Enon Hall's story in a new way and in a different way. So are there things that you've chosen to do as the storyteller, the current storyteller, that are different? Or what are you doing differently as the current storyteller? Because I know there are some things you're doing differently.
Yeah, this has been something that, as we learn more and more about the history of the house and the family and slavery in general, and it's been an eye-opener. I think I have only recently, and I posted it on Instagram because it felt like a marker for me, a revelation that right now it's not about what my family did, it's about what I do. And it's very easy to get so tied up in the history and to adapt that, or to feel like that identity is Gay and I are both very much into genealogy, into family history. And sometimes you reach a point where you're like, why am I spending so much time researching what they did and what their accomplishments were, when I really, we have a short time on this life. It should be about what's the mark we're going to leave on the world. That's where the focus ought to be. Yeah, all of this is background. It's informative. It's interesting. It's fascinating. It's a giant puzzle and all that. But it's really about what's the mark we're going to leave. We always knew that we were going to restore the outbuildings and restore the kitchen. And the conversation that I would have with people was always, what are you going to do with it? What are you going to turn it into? And usually they'd call it a shed in the process, which just showed, complete lack of understanding of what that building was. And we always knew that the only thing we were going to do is restore it to a kitchen quarters, not turn it into a man cave. There's another building in the county here that they turned it into an outdoor dining room. Yeah, a she shed, none of that. We were going to respect it. And there are not many of those buildings still around that are being cared for and that have been restored to their original intent. And a lot of that just has to do with respect for that history.
Right.
Then 2 weeks ago, we had an opportunity. Michael Twitty, who is a James Beard award-winning author and expert in Southern foodways, we connected on Instagram, and he was looking for a place to come cook and to bring some chefs to learn about hearth cooking and so forth. And we connected on Instagram, and within 15 minutes, it was like a done deal. And we had an amazing experience with these 8 African-American chefs and scholars of hearth cooking and very knowledgeable about Southern and African-American foodways and so forth, coming and using the kitchen. Not just Gay and I dabbling and learning and teaching ourselves. And then I finally saw, okay, now I know what this building is for.
Right. Exactly. Let's pause for just a second. Wow, I did.
So I have a friend who used to say, I would cry at a Walmart grand opening. But this does get to me.
It gets to me too.
It's totally getting to me right now. Sorry.
No, but I'm grateful for talking about it.
As am I. All right. I'm just going to get a sip of water. All right.
So from that experience, I think we saw what the purpose of that building is now, that kitchen quarters building. We want to make it available to people who are seriously studying hearth cooking, seriously in studying how kitchen quarters worked, how the enslaved people use them, and so forth. So that's going to be its purpose now. And that makes it feel like we not only restored it and respected it, but now it has a use in the world.
And is it my understanding that you're intending to perhaps add some new grave markers to the cemetery on the property?
Yeah, we definitely need to mark Priscilla Fauntleroy. She was thought enough of to be buried beside the family, but not given a marker. And I posted on Instagram last night something that, as I said in that post, it seriously pisses me off. There's a marker just outside the graveyard wall, and it's not a small marker. It's probably 18 inches by 30 inches that was put there in 1910 for a dog.
Wow.
And it's a marker that every descendant knows about, and anybody who comes here to visit, they always want to see, where's Max Maplemont? Show me Max Maplemont. The family thought enough of that dog to give him a marker, but 25 years prior did not think enough of Priscilla to mark her grave. So it's not right.
It's not right.
So as you became more popular, people felt that they really got to know you. Were there pros and cons to doing your work in the public eye where your blog and the forum had gotten to be so popular?
Absolutely. The website, the journal started to attract media attention. Washington Post did a story, CNN did a story, the Wall Street Journal. There were several magazine articles. So with each one of these, then more and more people would find the website, of course. It was wonderful. That community was really wonderful because we had a lot of people watching our work, and I was posting on an almost daily basis. Any day that we did work, I would share what we did. And we had people following along and correcting us. Like the first instance that I realized that there was this kind of value was when somebody emailed at that point and said, hey, all that insulation that you put up on that section of the house, it's backwards. You need to flip it over. So we had the wall open from the outside. The siding was off, and we're like, okay, hey, the wall's uninsulated. Let's insulate it. So we put it up with the paper, as you normally would, from the inside with the paper backing facing out. And they're like, no, that vapor barrier needs to be turned around. So felt like an idiot, but was also extremely appreciative. And the next day was out there flipping it all around. Had lots of recommendations along the way. Alex from Old Town Home,
yes,
who you just released that podcast. Yeah, he followed us for a long time, and it's hard to believe, but 16 years ago, he connected me with an Amish woodworker who reproduced a lot of window sashes for us, reproduced a set of double doors, had other people that were recommending a specific molder. So we got a lot of value. We also got a lot of criticism, as is the internet. You know, a lot of people who were very vocal about not agreeing with decisions that we made and so forth, which is a little tough to take when it's your house.
Right.
And then there was a wonderful lady that just out of the blue in the mail one day showed up a sampler, a hand-done sampler that she had made for us. Or she kind of explained, I'm always doing needlework, I'm always doing samplers, and said, just wanted y'all to have this. It's a beautiful piece of work and such a nice gesture, and not somebody who had been really engaging in a visible way with us. You know, the downside of it was we're both very private people. And I think that first shocking moment when we were in Richmond at a garden show and heard somebody go, it's the Enon Hall family. Like, whoa. I don't like being recognized in public. But more so, it was people who would just show up at the house who kind of had the perception that this was, since we're putting it all out there on this journal, then that means our doors are open and come on by anytime. And you both know when you're in the thick of a house project, as we always were, you're not presentable or ready to stop your work and conduct a tour. So that was a bit of the downside.
What would you say the most unusual stranger encounter you had was related to your notoriety that you never asked for?
I think the most unusual would have to be just being recognized out in public in Richmond.
You and your wife, Gay, raised your son, William, during this whole process. And did you and Gay have concerns about raising a child in this sort of long-term construction zone?
Yeah, when we first bought the place, we were coming on the weekends. So it was not a full-time residence where he was living all the time. And a lot of the projects that we were doing initially were really revealing, uncovering the old house and cleaning it up and tearing down. If we were doing something that we thought was like, there was a time when we were removing asbestos shingles, and he wasn't here for that. He was here for uncovering the front walk, which is when we discovered that he's not allergic, or at least wasn't at the time, to poison ivy, because he was basically rolling in it, didn't come up with it. Gay and I were covered, and William had none. And then when we built the addition, the protracted period where we were basically working on the house for 20 straight months, 7 days a week, we had really segmented the construction zone from where we were living. And we had, this is kind of like two attached houses. And we were able to live in the Dutch colonial, board off the doors that led into the area that was the construction zone. So there was not really an intermingling. We've never done anything here like sanding and removing paint that would be releasing lead. So it's been a careful process. For him, he was a big history buff from a very young age. And when we would come here on the weekends, lots of times if we didn't have time to do a project, or even while Mr. Hayden was still living here, our favorite thing to do was just come and dig a hole.
Right.
Because you cannot dig a hole anywhere here, well, maybe now you can, without finding something. And the very first hole that we dug, we came up with kind of if I was to pick, I'd be so excited if I could find this. That's what we found. We dug up a piece of ceramic pipe stem, the old long white clay pipes, tobacco pipes. And the cool thing about pipe stems, they were like cigarette butts from the 18th century and early 19th century. And the size of the bore, the hole in the stem, varied over the years. So you can actually date them based on, take a drill bit, stick it in there, match up the size. And there's a chart developed by Colonial Williamsburg, one of their archaeologists, that'll tell you how old it is. So he got sucked in at an early age to the history, to the discovery. And he was involved in projects when we realized we couldn't pull the old refrigerator out far enough to get behind it to paint because it was boxed in by counters. I just lowered him behind it's one of my favorite photos where he's in this little space of about 12 inches between the back of the refrigerator and the wall with a paint roller. And
send in the little guy, right?
That's right. He always had projects. I can tell you, going back to the stink and stench and nastiness, there were moments when he was overwhelmed. I think it was Gay was cleaning out under the stove, and we uncovered a particularly gnarly old mouse nest. And as we were grossing out, I looked out the window, and William was running down the road like Forrest Gump, just running away from the house. Like, okay, well, we've lost William. He's out.
Oh, the visual. I can just see it. Oh, that's hilarious. That's funny. Thank you for listening to True Tales from Old Houses. We invite you to check out the Descendants Project and part 2 of the interview with Bill Chapman from Enon Hall. This show would not be possible without the generous support of the Window Course, Sutherland Wells, Repaint Studios, and Old House Hub. To continue the conversation, visit us on Facebook and Instagram at True Tales from Old Houses. You may follow Daniel at Daniel Cantor and myself at Blake Hill House. Check out my brand new book, The Case for Historic Windows, The Truth About Energy Efficiency in Old Windows, available at blakehillhouse.com. In the meantime, take care and keep celebrating the stories that make your old house a home. Until next time.